Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about an archetype that I'm eyeing right now for next League Start, which is Manastacker. And I still remember the Manastackers in its heyday back when Archmage first came out. We had a lot of crazy builds. The most prominent one was probably Akane's Mana Miner. A lot of you guys will remember that one. And nowadays, it has been a little bit more of a niche. And the reason for that is mostly that it just isn't very good early. You need gear. But once you get that gear going, it goes quite crazy. There's also certain snapshots that you can do. So, for example, in Deep Delve, you can just check out Connor's channel. He will tell you all about it. He has a lot of versions over the years. He's been holding steady on the Mana train. The one thing and the one reason why I was always disinterested in the Mana archetype is because it's not really my kind of deal. It has a lot of raw power, but it doesn't really have the comfiness of play or the speed that, for example, most of the right side builds that I usually play. Which is why it kind of fell out of favor, because that is what most people are actually farming. But especially with Valdo's map coming out, it's not just Deep Delve anymore that needs character power, because most content isn't really hidden behind character power nowadays. It's more like speed or quant or whatever. Now we have a fix for that. So the early game for Manastackers was always the big problem that I had with it. I cannot really recommend it to somebody on League Start unless I know they're easily going to get to the items, and then they can start whatever they want anyways, right? So, but for most people, until you get that Mjolnir, until you get that Ivory Prison set up, before this patch, it was actually kind of hard for me to recommend. This league changes everything though, and that is for one particular change, which is the Archmage support. Now, why is that big of a deal? If we look at current Archmage, it used to scale off of your mana cost, which was very strong when you could increase your mana cost quite a bit later in the game with Indigon. But the problem was the sustain was kind of rough, especially before you get that leech from some kind of attack skill. In fact, I wouldn't just say rough, I would say basically impossible. And that's what always made it a little bit awkward, especially since they actually did eliminate quite a bit of mana recovery sources over the years. Also, mana flasks are not what they used to be. What is the change though? Well, instead of scaling off of the mana cost that you have on Archmage, it now straight up just scales off of your unreserved maximum mana. Now, it still increases your mana. There's still the effect with supported skills have an added mana cost equal to 5% of unreserved mana, but that is now just there to feed Indigon, and it is not anything that you need to consider on early league. You can actually reduce your mana cost. Now, if we do the quick math here, that means at level 21, which is 20% most likely, right? It scales from 10 to 19, 10 at level 1, 19 at level 20. We're just going to take the level 21 because it's quite easy to do. We don't even know what the quality does right now. Whatever. It's going to be 20% of your mana as extra lightning. 5,000 mana, therefore, means you get a straight 1,000 lightning damage. And I just want to make this clear. This is average damage. This is not 1 to 1,000. 1 to 1,000 would be 500 average damage, or 500.5. No, it's like having, for example, 1 to 2,000. And there's no lucky nowadays anymore, or at least not early anyways. So this 1,000 damage, that is real flat damage that you're adding. Now, on the POBs that I made that we're going to talk about a little bit, which I just threw together. This is nothing like specific. We're talking about around about 90 to 100% more damage at 5 to 7k mana. But it's not even the full truth, because you also become less reliant on Arcane Cloak uptime. Now, Arcane Cloak right now is your main source of flat damage. If we look right here, you can see that you're going to spend a certain portion of your mana and you then get that as flat damage. That is the same multiplier as Archmage. Now, a lot of mana builds in the past were very reliant on Arcane Cloak uptime, but it's not up all the time. Even if you take Dynamo, even if you take these mana notes for the CDR, even if you scale like Potency of Will and stuff like that, you're still looking at damage downtime, which felt quite horrible. But now, if you turn off Arcane Cloak, it is actually not even that rough anymore. Once you have that Archmage fully running, you're talking about it being like going from a 6 to a 7 link, not from a 6 to a 9 link. So overall, your damage just becomes way more consistent over time. You're also not reliant on gem levels. This is true for Manastackers in general. It was also kind of true before, but gem levels don't do much because they increase your base damage. You're already getting so much base damage from different sources, and while you might say that's a downside in endgame, which it really isn't, Manastackers have infinite scaling through whatever they want, basically. But for early game, that's actually quite a big deal. Getting +2 gem levels and other relevant stats, especially when you also want to stack mana and stuff like that, is quite a big deal. So not having to get that at all it's pretty big. Now, another thing that I want to highlight here is just how much damage this build can do on almost nothing. So I just threw together this POB right here with LE Overload. Just to quickly show you my gear, this is the kind of gear you expect. This is a tier 5 unique, right? You can replace it for a rare. It's mostly nice because of the damage recoup that's mana. I really like this Mind Sparrow. Last time I played Manastackers a while ago, but I just remember this helmet. I think I have, like, action speed on the boots or something, yeah. But I don't even have any Eldritch Implicits. It's not even a Vaal Regalia, right? In endgame, you can probably go evasion bases. That's all fine. You can even go for spell suppression if you want to. But just the raw HP you have, like, if you look at this, 4k life, unreserved 3.4k. On top of that, 4.9k ES. Both of these can be leeched, right? And then you have mana of like 8.4k. Your mana regen is quite good at 1.1k life. And we'll also talk about the mana cost in a second here. But in general, this is a very, very solid shell. Now, obviously, if you turn up off all of these conditionals, you're probably going to land at around about 3 million. But that is fine. 3 million for mapping is way more than most League starters can ever ask for. But what made early Manastacker that bad? It wasn't just the lack of damage, the reliance on Arcane Cloak. It was also the problem of mana recovery. Without having any access to mana leech, without being Mjolnir, without being cast on crit, or any of those things, cast watch, whatever you want, without mana recovery, because there's no mana leech for spells, you're just kind of left stacking mana regen, and that is quite a big problem. Mana regen and mana recovery. Now, that in itself wouldn't be that big of a problem, but your main scalers, which is Archmage and Indigon, both want you to spend ridiculous amounts of mana to get your damage. However, that is gone now. You do not need to actually spend that mana anymore on Archmage if you don't want to. You can now actually go for stuff like Inspiration, or sources of reduced mana cost. Look at this right here, 195. This 1 point takes it down to 166. We're scaling reduced mana cost. And right here, you can see an Inspiration with 20 quality right here reduces your mana cost like almost like half. And it still gives you a ton of damage. So in general, that is big. But the biggest thing probably is the ability to take Sanctuary of Thought without up your Archmage support. Used to be that these two don't really go hand in hand. Less mana cost, not very good if we're looking at old Archmage that scaled your damage from mana cost. Now it's not reliant on the cost itself, only on your maximum mana. So now you can actually take Sanctuary of Thought, which opens up Ball Lightning in early game. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But Ball Lightning with that much AoE is absolutely ridiculous. And yes, I'm talking about normal Ball Lightning. Now, another nice thing you can do early game is mana recoup. You can get it on rings, but mostly you're just going to get it from this cluster down here, from Battle Rouse, and then also take one of these masteries right here for another 10%. This helps quite a bit because now that your mana loss is mostly going to come from enemy hits instead of your own mana cost, recoup works exactly against that. Now, what skill to play though? I said earlier that the thing that I'm interested in is the part before you get a Mjolnir, before you get your perfect setup rolling, before you get 20, 30 Divines. That is what matters. For me, this is an easy pick. It's normal Ball Lightning. Now, why is Ball Lightning so good with Manastacker? It is mostly because you have easy access to AoE, which is actually quite hard nowadays without itemizing into it. And on Manastackers, you need very specific gear, so it's not just like you can just throw in a Carcass Jack for funsies. Now, the way normal Ball Lightning works is it's basically this ball. I think on this character I have some projectile speed, but basically it just gets cast, and while it is cast, don't let yourself fool by the animation. It actually has a way bigger AoE. If you, for example, look at the POB right here, which is the 1-2 Divine, whatever you want to call it, you can see right here, this is actually how far it procs. And the way this skill works is a little bit counterintuitive. You can throw more Ball Lightnings with cast speed, but it zaps enemies at a fixed rate, and it can only hit for a certain amount of time. So while the Ball Lightning is going through an enemy, so just think about this, right? You have Ball Lightning. This is the visible Ball Lightning, and then this is the AoE that actually hits in. And it goes towards an enemy. As long as this enemy is going through here, it can be zapped up to 13 times. Which means in a best case scenario with a 60% damage effectiveness, you can do a total of 780% damage effectiveness. However, for that to happen, you need the ball to stay on the enemy for long enough without screwing up your clear, right? So for example, if you go down here and you go for something like adjacent animosity and then less projectile speed or something, you're going to completely obliterate your clear. So the better thing is to just make the area bigger, right? So obviously, you can also make the projectile slower, which we're still doing, right? Slower proj is still fine. Like I said, on this character, I have increased projectile speed, so it's not the, I guess, maybe not the best example. We can, for example, unspec these two. Then it would already look a lot better. Yep. So while this goes for enemies, you want to hit up to 13 times. But if you just make the AoE bigger, it has longer time to zap until it leaves the enemy. Which is also why, by the way, you don't want to stand on top of the enemy. Because what happens if your enemy is directly where you cast it, now you're basically losing half of your damage uptime, or maybe not half, but like a third, because now it has less time to go through them. Now, one thing about Ball Lightning, though, is that it only has one projectile, and there's not really a good way to scale additional projectiles. Don't get me wrong, they don't shotgun, right? If you put GMP in, that is not going to shotgun, which is natural because it already has like 700 plus damage effectiveness. Otherwise, it would be completely broken. But that also means that if you put GMP in your setup, you're going to do a lot less single target damage, and you don't ever want to gem swap. So what do you do? Well, there's a support gem that is basically made for Ball Lightning, obviously for a lot of other skills as well. But it is a long forgotten support gem that doesn't get as much use as I think it should, and that's Pinpoint Support. Now, this is basically the mechanic of intensity, right? So basically you start out at +3 projectiles and you get less projectile damage. It scales up to only like a little bit less damage, it's like 14-ish or something. But what happens is if you're standing still, you're building intensity. So as you can see, I start out with 4 projectiles, and while mapping, I always have 4 projectiles, right? 3 to 4, depending on how much I have up top, 3 to 4. And that is a big deal for clear. However, when I'm at a boss and I do this, now you can see the intensity stacks go up, and they go up to 3. And now you get more damage, but you lose additional projectiles. And since it doesn't shotgun, it's the perfect support gem for the skill. The only thing you cannot do, and I'm just going to point this out because a lot of people do this wrong, is you cannot take the mastery with +1 intensity, because what happens is it actually scales you down to 0 projectiles. Just so you know, unless you have like Dying Sun, maybe for mapping, but in general, stay away from the mastery. Another big reason why Ball Lightning is actually quite interesting is because of Instant Leech. Instant Leech wants you to hit a lot because it is capped, but if you hit a lot, you can basically just fill up immediately. Now, in endgame, this is something you are going to have. Once you have Mana Leech available, you can have Triple Leech, right? You can leech your 5k ES. You're going to have way more. It's going to be a different version, right? All good. But what I'm saying is the amount of procs you're going to get is ridiculous. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that you couldn't theoretically play Mana Bond early if you really wanted to. The main issue here is for Mana Bond to do full damage, you have to have missing mana. And if you have missing mana, your Mind Over Matter is not there to protect you. So especially early when you're going to be a little bit squishier, that's going to be kind of rough. As well as that, Mana Bond already gets a ton of flat damage, so adding more flat damage on top, it is not the best use for Archmage support. Having Archmage support, though, does open up quite a bit of new gems that you could introduce. Now, there's obviously other stuff, right? Like Spark got buffed, for example. If we look at the patch notes right here, Spark of Unpredictability got a buff. I don't know if it's back too good. The problem on the left side of the tree is also always to actually get that proj speed. And yes, proj speed to 2 is back, but you're not really pathing for any dex nodes anyways. Plus, Spark also can't really make use of the AoE right here. So while the world is your oyster in terms of what skills you want to use, I think there is a very strong point to be made for normal basic Ball Lightning. So what that means is in the next couple of days over on twitch.tv/Palsteron, I'm going to be testing quite a bit of setups. Obviously, I have other stuff to test as well, but when it comes to after campaign, so let's quickly talk about leveling. When can you actually transition to mana stacking? In my opinion, so far, from what I've seen from the POBs that I looked at, it is probably going to be after campaign, which for a Hierophant is actually really good news, or for a Templar in general. Templar has some of the best leveling with Rolling Magma, Armageddon Brand, that's all fine. What I'm going to test is actually normal EO, non-mana stacking Ball Lightning. If that's going to pan out, I'm fine with that, right? If you want to be faster, you obviously just go the good old racing route. But that is what I'm going to try out. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. But at level, I don't know, 68, 69, 70 in this case, whenever you finish campaign and you've reached both Dynamo and Battle Rouse, you get all your mana masteries, you got Prodigal Perfection, and you have roundabout, this is not really realistic for early game, right? Early game, you're going to have like 3k life, 2.5k life. That is where it starts happening. And that's also where you start getting your third lab, which is going to be Sanctuary of Thought. And when it comes to Uber Lab, I'm most likely going to go Illuminated Devotion first. Until we have that Cluster Jewel, I really want that Spell Leech right here, plus even more AoE, which also means we can probably cut some of these AoE nodes as well, which frees up a little bit of space. And when it comes to crit, you will have seen that I go Elemental Overload for a long time. And that's for a few reasons. First up, mana builds already, I mean, they don't need much gear, but needing a life roll, needing a mana roll, on top of capping your resistances, is still not nothing. You would also like to have the occasional mana regen roll. having to also scale crit on that, especially when it comes to weapon and your shield early, can be quite rough. So for that reason, the testing I will be doing is a lot on EO. That is obviously not the end game build you're going to go for. And for a mid-game build, like kind of like something before Mjolnir, before you get your Indigon, because it's not just about getting those items. It's also about getting the setup right and getting your mana regen right to sustain Indigon. Before that, I'm actually looking into Sandstorm Visage. I think there's a good chance that there is still some space in between there, especially if these builds are meta, to just go Sandstorm Visage in between, still go crit, but not quite be completely reliant on that mana stacking playstyle. And then you can get that very weak base crit of Ball Lightning, which is 5% up to like 10 or 11. At that point, you would have a cluster jewel for Life Leech, and the AoE is not going to be as important. So you're going to unspec these points. You're going to go Conviction of Power, get those power charges. Also, a nice thing about delaying crit, by the way, is that you actually don't need the endurance charges all that early anymore, because you will now get automated Enduring Cry, which will be quite a big help against physical hits. But yeah, that's about all I got for this one. I have to test the leveling version still. I don't want to put anything out before I've tested it, so it takes a little bit of time, but probably in 1 or 2 days I will have an update video out, and if I league start it, I'll put out a full league starter. In general, I think Manastackers are in a great place when it comes to end game, like hundreds of divines. I'm pretty sure it's quite nerfed. If you want info on that, I would definitely check out Connor Converse. He has quite a bit of videos accumulated over the years. Very good info on that, especially if you haven't played this archetype in a while. It's very easy to refresh. But I guess the word I would use, the archetype is getting a lot fairer, less snapshotty, less, I don't know, spiky, and a lot more flatline, especially towards early and mid game, which is something I love to hear, especially for a league start scenario. And they have shaken up the meta quite a bit, so this is going to be an interesting one indeed. But with that being said, since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.